By order of the Church Commissioners. As required by Section 8(1) of the Pastoral Measure 1968, the Church Commissioners hereby give notice that they have submitted for confirmation by Her Majesty in Council a scheme for uniting the benefices and parishes of St Sepulchre, Cambridge, and All Saints, Cambridge, all situate in the Diocese of Ely, and for declaring redundant the Church of All Saints, Cambridge.
So what do you do with a redundant church, especially one as important as this one? This is All Saints Church in Jesus Lane in Cambridge. For years, it was one of the most important churches in a city which, let's face it, is not exactly short of places of worship. But by the 1970s, it was surplus to requirements, and it was only a vigorous public campaign that saved it from the bulldozers. Why the fuss? Because this is not your average parish church. This is a Victorian, pre-Raphaelite masterpiece. Stenciling on the walls and roof is by the firm of William Morris & Co., leaders of the famous arts and crafts movement. The biblical figures in this magnificent east window were designed by William Morris himself and the leading pre-Raphaelite painters Ford Madox Brown and Edward Burne-Jones. And this wonderfully decorated pulpit was designed by the architect George Bodley. It's no surprise that Sir Nicholas Pevsner, the leading expert on English architecture, called All Saints the best 19th century ecclesiastical architecture in Cambridge. But how on earth did a simple parish church, not even a college chapel, come to attract some of the leading artists of the day? And how did it come to be abandoned?
There's no doubt the Victorians took their religion seriously. Just look at how many churches they built in Cambridge alone. But why did such a modern, technologically obsessed people deliberately design their churches to look older than they were? Bodley designed All Saints to look as if it was a genuine medieval church, complete with gargoyles. The triumph of his design was the beautifully elegant spire. It soared up above the skyline, the tallest structure in Cambridge, when it went up in 1871.
Buildings give off messages. So, what message was All Saints giving off? A Victorian church which was sort of pretending that it was medieval. It's all the more curious when you consider that the original All Saints, the old All Saints, had been a medieval church, and it had stood here. This is Trinity Street, right in the historic heart of Cambridge. Old All Saints stood here in what used to be Cambridge's Jewish quarter. It was just opposite the entrance to St John's College, just over there. That was quite normal. Many medieval churches were built opposite the entrance to colleges and served as college chapels. So this was a good position, and All Saints flourished. This is the church's parish magazine for January 1917, and if you look here you can see there's a plan of the old church. It's got pews for the university, there's Trinity College, Jesus College, St John's, Sidney Sussex, and for various individuals, parishioners. So we've got Mr Wiseman, Mr Coe, Mr Baxter, and so on. Now, pews weren't just benches that you sat on. They were quite high structures with a wall around them. In fact, one description said they were more like a room. In fact, if you look, there's even a door between two pews here, one for the vicar's servants to get through. They were stacked up with their steps going up on both sides so that you could see the vicar without everyone else being able to peer at you. Like all churches, All Saints reflected the society that it served. And All Saints attracted some of the very highest people in the university and in the town.
By Victorian times, congregations were so large that the old building wasn't big enough to hold them all comfortably. To make things worse, Trinity Street desperately needed to be widened, and All Saints was in the way. Already they'd had to knock a hole through the tower to let pedestrians through. Clearly, the old church would have to go. And in 1865, the demolition men arrived. Down came the famous tower and its passageway, and then the rest of the building. All that was left of the medieval church of All Saints was a small garden.
And here it is, a little oasis of calm in the middle of the busy city. The cross here marks the site of the original church, and there are the names of some of the parishioners written around the pedestal. Nowadays the garden is used at weekends for a craft market, and probably few of the people who come have any idea that there was ever a church here at all. But moving All Saints doesn't explain why the new church had to be so big with such a tall spire. And it certainly doesn't explain why it had to look medieval.
All Saints wasn't the only church being built in the 1860s. With new churches and chapels going up all over the town, mid-Victorian Cambridge was one huge building site. Now that All Saints had gone, St John's College needed a new chapel. But look at its bell tower. Just like All Saints' spire, it was huge, much bigger than it strictly needed to be. These churches were being built big.
It was part of a sort of holy war against the whole impact of science and technology on modern life itself. Victorian Britain was mad on science and technology. Even sleepy old academic Cambridge built this magnificent steam pumping engine to deal with the city's appalling sewage problems. But all this technology came at a fearful cost in terms of poverty and misery and hunger. Victorian newspapers were full of ghastly stories of the sort of conditions in which ordinary people had to work and live. Had this modern technological world lost sight of the human values that had been there in the past? In the medieval past in particular, a lot of people thought it had done just that.
One person who thought the Victorians had a lot to learn from the past was the art critic John Ruskin. He thought the modern world should pause a moment and take a long look at the work of the skilled craftsmen of the Middle Ages, who, he thought, had been healthy, independent and free. Very different from the poor, downtrodden, ill-fed workers of Victorian factories.
William Morris wanted to revive the arts and crafts of medieval workmanship, promoting proper respect for the working man. But the key to recapturing the true spirit of the Middle Ages lay in the church. A brand new church in the centre of Cambridge. It was too good an opportunity to miss. They queued up to work on it. Edward Burne-Jones, Ford Madox Brown, William Morris. Look at the craftsmanship and the beauty of medieval decoration, they were saying. That's how we should be living our lives. But hang on. The medieval church had been Catholic. Were they saying that the Church of England should somehow be more Catholic? Because if they were, that was mid-Victorian, religious dynamite. This was Cambridge, the birthplace of England's Protestant Reformation. Here, in Great St Mary's, the University Church, the great Protestant reformer Thomas Cranmer had preached. In fact, he very likely preached at All Saints as well. And just up the road, off King's Parade, was the White Horse Inn, where so many supporters of Martin Luther used to gather that it was even nicknamed Little Germany. Now, Victorian Cambridge hadn't forgotten its Protestant heritage. It saw the Catholic Church as a lot of superstitious nonsense with its incense and its bells and everyone believing everything the Pope said. Protestant countries were forward, free-thinking ones like the United States or Germany or, of course, Britain. Catholic countries were seen as oppressive, backward and poor. Italy, Spain, Poland or, of course, Ireland. But now, 300 years after Henry VIII had taken England out of the Church of Rome, the Church of Rome was back. In 1850, the Vatican established a hierarchy of Catholic bishops, archbishops, and even cardinals in England and Wales. Now, why? A lot of people thought this craze for the medieval church was to blame. Would this fascination with the Middle Ages lead to mass conversions to Catholicism? Or could Protestant Cambridge get the balance right? Celebrate the medieval past, but remain within the Church of England? All Saints Church was designed to show that it could. But All Saints had another role, and it was one that was going to take its influence all around the world. And to find out why, just look over here. In 1857, just a few years before All Saints was built, a very important visitor came to give a couple of public lectures in the Senate House, just there. They were a sellout because the speaker was none other than David Livingstone.
Livingstone had made a huge name for himself with his voyages of exploration in Africa, but Livingstone believed the people of Africa needed spiritual salvation. They needed missionaries, teachers, doctors, all of the very highest calibre.
In the years that followed Livingstone's visit, hundreds of Cambridge graduates went out to work as missionaries in mission stations all over Britain's global empire. Some of them went to Delhi, where in 1881 a special Cambridge mission school was set up. Others worked in the darkest corners of Britain's industrial cities. These eager young missionaries were going to need special training, though, in training colleges, like this one. This is Westcott House, named after its founder, Bishop Brooke Foss Westcott, Regius Professor of Divinity and a parishioner at All Saints. Bishop Westcott wasn't interested in fine details of medieval ritual. He wanted to get the Christian gospel out to people who needed it. Bishop Westcott's missionaries needed to know about the Christian gospel. They also needed to know how to run a mission station. They needed to know about irrigation, farming, basic medicine and first aid. Above all, they needed to know how to preach. And where better to get some practice in than in the splendid medieval-style church just next door. Preaching from this pulpit on a Sunday morning must have been a pretty daunting prospect for a young trainee. All Saints attracted some high-powered theologians to its congregation. But the effort clearly paid off. Thanks to the preaching practice that they gained here, the students at Westcott House made it one of the best-known colleges in the country, with very close links with the missions out in the Empire. The congregation here at All Saints maintained 2 girls at school in India and a boy in Burma. And they got regular reports for the parish magazine.
Ramnad, North India. I am sending you a short note at last to thank you very heartily for the box, which arrived safely. Everything sent was useful. I am sorry to tell you that there is a prospect of a terrible time of scarcity in front of us, if not famine. The rains have failed again, the 4th year in succession. Coming on top of Arbuthnot's failure, this year has been bad enough, but next year we positively dread. All Saints Parish Magazine, March 1908.
For most of the 20th century, All Saints was a lively, active, even quite prominent city parish. But by the 1970s, it was earmarked for closure. What had gone wrong? Well, the answer's quite simple. The people had moved away. As the post-war suburbs grew, people moved out of the centre of Cambridge and they no longer attended the city churches. The old medieval parishes, even the old Victorian ones, struggled to find a place in 70s Cambridge. In 1973, the church was declared redundant and the parish was closed. The vicarage was pulled down to make way for student flats, but no one knew quite what to do with the rest of the building. There were plans to turn it into a theatre, a concert venue, even a toy museum. The Bishop of Ely wanted to pull the whole thing down and give some of it to Westcott House. He anticipated protests. "Oh, we shall get a bucketful from somewhere," he said, and he was right. A group of friends of All Saints was set up, and they managed to hold off the bulldozers, but they just didn't have the money to do anything else. And so this beautiful pre-Raphaelite church went into decay.
Quite early on, it looked as if the way forward was to try and get the church vested in the Redundant Churches Fund, as it then was. And we came in here on a dark, wet Sunday afternoon in February, the worst time of the year, and the church looked really sad. But you could see, despite all that, that it had enormous potential and that it could be a great place again. And that is what we aimed at doing. And I went to lots of meetings with lots of important people, and I was quite young then, and I felt quite overawed, but I knew that what we had to do was to try and convince them that this church was of great importance, if they didn't know it already. And I think most of them did, actually.
Bit by bit, In stages, the Redundant Churches Trust and the City Council raised money to restore All Saints. Conservators were brought in to restore the wall paintings and reconstruct the original stenciling. The plaster was repaired and the surviving monuments cleaned, and the whole process was carefully recorded for future generations.
It is now on the tourist guide, and people do come and look at it. And I think it's probably certainly one of the finest Victorian buildings in Cambridge.
Nowadays, All Saints belongs to the Churches Conservation Trust. That's the new name for the old Redundant Churches Trust. It's been reopened to the public and is even being used for Sunday services again. You could say that this is the church that rose from the dead. But the story doesn't end quite there. There's one last, perhaps ironic, little twist. And to find it, we need to go back to All Saints' Victorian origins. 20 years after All Saints went up, another big, flamboyantly medieval Victorian church was being built in Cambridge, in a prominent position at a major junction on the way in and out of the city. Its builders were determined that it should be bigger and its spire even higher than All Saints. This is the Church of Our Lady and the English Martyrs. That's the English Catholic martyrs. This is a Catholic church. All Saints had tried so hard to show that you could celebrate England's medieval past without tipping over into Catholicism. But in the end, for all their medieval decoration and ritual and their preaching and their missionary work, those Protestant Victorians couldn't keep the Catholics out. But that's another story.